Hi everyone. Welcome to the BCACC's first Vancouver edition for 2016 of the Skills for Mindful Living series. We have Elana Sures here to present tonight, and just a couple words. So, my apologies for the delay. I just had to change something on the camera. It's all fixed. We're good to go. The washrooms for men are just out this door here. The washrooms for women are just down the hall to the left. If by any chance you have to leave halfway through, the doors are locked in the elevators as well, so you won't be able to get back in if you are heading out. My name is Amber. I'm a Registered Clinical Counsellor here in Vancouver. I do private practice at Summit Counselling Group. And tonight we are here for Elana's presentation on postpartum adjustment. Elana is, it's on the sheet here. Sorry. So Elana is a registered clinical counselor who specializes in relationships and postpartum adjustment. She's trained in emotionally focused therapy and also has an extensive background in mental health counseling. She has a private practice in Vancouver. And for more information on her counseling practice, you can visit her website at elanasures.ca. Here it is on the bottom of your screen. We'd like to welcome you to Adler University as well and thank them for their generous donation of this space. So I will hand this over.
Thank you, and thanks everybody for coming. Before we get started, I just want to survey the crowd a little bit to find out what brings everybody here. So how many people are here for professional interest? Oh, that's a lot. Excellent. How many of you who raised your hands are also therapists or counselors? That's also a lot. Can you raise your hand if you're part of another professional discipline that's interested? Okay, I see the midwife corner over there. Now, how many of you are here for personal interest? Okay, great. Any expectant parents here? Congratulations. Any new parents here? Newish parents? Good for you for making it out of the house. So it's a pleasure for me to talk about this subject tonight. As Amber said, I do have a specialty in postpartum adjustment and reproductive mental health. Currently, about half my practice are either pregnant women, couples who have recently had babies, parents even of older children, or people trying to get pregnant. So I feel very at home in this particular milieu. In fact, it was difficult typing out all these slides. I feel like for each slide I could probably present an hour or two on each one. So I'm going to do my best to rein myself in. And if I don't, can somebody just hug their ear or something like that, and I'll move on. So, as many of you know, welcome.
Thank you.
As many of you know, when we talk about the postpartum period of adjustment, what comes to mind first for people?
Hormones?
Hormones, yes. That is a big part of it, absolutely. Anything else?
Baby blues.
Baby blues. Yeah.
Sleep deprivation.
Sleep deprivation. Okay, so far we're covering all of these things, so we're good. The reason I like the term postpartum adjustment is that it captures, I think, what almost everybody with a new baby, male or female, biological or adoptive, experiences. I will start off the presentation by just exploring some of the more extreme and intense postpartum presentations, depression and anxiety and other mental health issues, because I think it's important. And then I'll be moving on to really sink our teeth into postpartum adjustment. So the personal experience, the relational experience, and also the parenting culture experience, which is a real thing. So I will be talking, I can't, because of our time constraint, talk too much in depth about therapeutic strategies, but I will be talking for you therapists in the room, specifically about a few models of therapy that I particularly like to use with my clients. But also the focus is very much on self-help, but also how we can fine-tune our relationships with people, whether they're your clients or close friends or family members who are going through this particular stage. How you can ask the right questions and kind of tune into the right things. So I'm going to start by talking about what I think somebody in this corner just said, baby blues. So baby blues are sort of those first couple weeks, really the first 10 to 14 days where you're sort of just shell-shocked by what's just happened to you. So this is really common. 50 to 70% of new moms will experience some baby blues. Tearfulness, irritability, just feeling really overwhelmed and down, exhausted. So while this is normal, what we tend to do in this, the approach that I would recommend taking is monitoring. If this is happening to you or if this is happening to somebody that you're working with. Sometimes people feel like this must be evidence of postpartum depression, but because it's so early on in the game, it's only been the first 10 to 14 days, it's I would say, in my experience, closer to 70% of new moms will experience crying jags, feelings of incompetence, wondering what they got themselves into. The best treatment at this point is support. So helping people out, holding babies so that the moms can sleep. It's really about kind of allying support networks within the family, outside of the family, and seeing how you can make this person's life easier. So keeping your eye on it, monitoring it, certainly reaching out if you feel like this isn't feeling like me at all, can be really helpful. In terms of who you reach out to and who you look for support to, I always recommend primary care providers first, midwives, doctors, nurses, whoever's kind of doing those. Do they still do well baby visits? I heard a rumor so they do still do them? Okay, good. I heard a horrible rumor about them being cut, and I was terrified. So, yeah, monitoring and support. So in terms of postpartum depression, this is kind of the one that gets the most attention. This is, when we hear about the gamut of postpartum issues, it's depression, postpartum depression, that gets the most attention. And while I think that's good, because it deserves a lot of attention, sometimes people feel that if they're not feeling depressed, then it doesn't warrant attention from caregivers. I'll get onto that later. It's been really hard to get accurate statistics about what percentage of new mothers experience postpartum depression, but the newest research is suggesting that it's actually really underreported. I think typically I read 10%, but some of the newer research is as far as 1 out of 23%, which is 1 out of 5, maybe even 1 out of 4. Also the onset we're learning a lot more about the onset of postpartum depression in the research. So typically the DSM-5, I think, they didn't change it in the newest edition, but it still stipulates that the onset should be within 4 weeks of delivery, which we know is totally inaccurate. Postpartum depression can show up, actually, and prenatal depression is one of the biggest predictors of postpartum depression. And some people can experience kind of a latent postpartum depression with up to 30 weeks, so that's, you know, having a 7-month-old. In terms of risk factors, the greatest risk is people who have who have had a mood disorder in the past, so who have experienced depression in the past or experienced it during their pregnancy. And that's simply because their brain already knows how to be depressed, and the hormonal aspects of pregnancy and the absolute stress of caring for a newborn accelerate that. So it doesn't mean that it's carved in stone, but it's a risk factor. So for that reason, people who are caring for pregnant women or who are close to or connected to people during pregnancy who are known to have a history of depression or anxiety, sometimes it's really recommended to get counseling while you're still pregnant, to do the tuning up while you're still, when you don't have a newborn to take care of, essentially. You know, as we move on through the presentation, we'll talk a lot about asking the right questions and highlighting really relevant things, but when the baby is born, what happens is people become consumed with looking after their baby, and they become quite reticent sometimes to reach out for help. I don't know if anybody in this room has experienced that with clients or close friends, family, or with yourselves, that sometimes it's difficult to know if one ought to reach out for help. Sometimes the shame of feeling overwhelmed is a barrier in and of itself. So it's not a given that somebody who has just had a baby and is starting to experience classic depression signs, so just to recap what those are, low mood, suicidal thoughts, just intensely negative thoughts, loss of changes in appetite, exhaustion, low motivation, low energy. You know, some of these are kind of par for the course as it is with a new baby. Not the suicidal thoughts, but the other aspects. So there's a lot of second guessing of oneself. It's not, one thing I have heard again and again from my clients who have experienced postpartum depression is that they kind of wondered if they should reach out or if they would just get over this on their own. Or they sort of felt like, if I reach out, we know that people's thinking is really biased when they're depressed. They don't necessarily appraise situations accurately, so there's a lot of fear about reaching out for help, fear about the baby being taken away, or fear about looking incompetent. So it's really critical that we ask the right questions to people who are, even whether they're at risk for postpartum depression or exhibiting those signs, exhibiting signs that are concerning in terms of their mood and their behavior. Are there any questions about that? Because that's a really important point to make, I think. So the first line treatment, I'm happy to say, for postpartum depression, I want to caveat that mild to moderate postpartum depression, the first line treatment is psychotherapy. Why? Because the first line treatment for depression that's mild to moderate is psychotherapy. Medication is indicated with more severe, moderate to severe forms of depression. It's not to say that people with moderate or mild depression should not take medication. It's more to say that the research shows that medication is the most efficacious for the more moderate to severe presentations of depression. And with pregnant and nursing women, there's, if they are taking medication, it's usually prescribed by a psychiatrist who specializes in reproductive mental health. Fortunately, we have an excellent reproductive mental health team here in Vancouver, BC Women's. So the the treatment, the psychological treatment that has undergone a lot of research for postpartum depression specifically is interpersonal psychotherapy. Is anybody here familiar with interpersonal psychotherapy? It's funny because it's, as a therapist, as a counselor, when you hear evidence-based, you think CBT automatically, or I do. Does anybody else? But for postpartum depression, and in fact for depression in general, interpersonal psychotherapy is a fairly well-researched form of therapy, and it goes about the treatment in a slightly different way than CBT. It really emphasizes the interpersonal relationships. So, I'm just going to skip ahead. So, the interpersonal relationships rather than the cognitive features of the depression. Typically when we focus on the cognitive features of the depression, we focus on the thoughts, that, like the negative thoughts that a person is having. Why would we focus on the personal relationships of a brand new parent instead of the thoughts? Because it's the personal relationships that probably have the most influence in terms of helping to support them and also helping to make it, contributing to some of the role transitions and just the changes in sense of self and sense of other that are occurring at this particular transition in life. Makes sense to me. So with interpersonal psychotherapy, it rests on a biopsychosocial model. So biologically, we acknowledge that there's lots of hormones happening. There's been changes to the body which affect one's sense of self-esteem and self-worth, changes to the brain, changes that are impacted by sleep and breastfeeding and having just given birth. So we don't want to ignore the biological aspect. However, it also really heavily focuses on the social aspect, so those key relationships in one's life. And one thing that I love about it, and which I don't think you need to be a therapist to really appreciate, is that discrepancy between desired support and perceived support. So when we desire a certain level of support or attention or nurturing from the people in our lives, we don't always vocalize it. Sometimes we do, but we don't always vocalize it. Sometimes we're not even aware of it. Sometimes we don't actually articulate in our own mind, this is what I want, this is what would help me. But we do know that sense of disappointment we get, or that sense of frustration that we experience, or hopelessness even, when we're not getting what we hope for in terms of attention and relationships. And when that happens, if we're already vulnerable in other ways, so if we have maybe a predisposition to depression, if we've had a difficult birth or a particularly difficult baby, or even if we're just finding the transition really overwhelming, that discrepancy can kind of be the tipping point. Does that make sense? Yeah? Sure, go ahead, yeah.
So I'm not getting the discrepancy between desired and perceived.
Mm-hmm. Desired is what we want. Oh,
And perceived is...
Oh, you're right. My bad. So desired and experienced. So desired is what we want. I'll flesh that out a little bit more. Experienced is what we're actually getting. But I don't, as I'm thinking about it, perceived, it still works, to be honest. If I perceive that I'm not getting something, perception doesn't equal reality necessarily. So my perception might be, okay, I'll use an example. Let's say I'm exhausted, I've been up all night, I just want to sleep, and I just saw a text from my partner saying that he's going off to go for a drink with friends and he'll be home in a few hours. So my perception might be he doesn't love me, he doesn't want this baby, he never wanted this baby. I might say to myself, I don't know, what are some other things, audience, that one might say to themselves if they're feeling overwhelmed and just desperately wanting some support, and then they get that type of text? What are some of the things that might come up?
I'm doing it on my own.
I'm all on my own here.
Resentment.
Right. How dare he? So, yes, it is. Thank you for pointing that out. It's a fine line, but our perceptions, we don't really, we kind of go from 0 to 60 sometimes when we have a perception that sort of activates a fear, or that activates an attachment issue. Attachment to our partners, attachment to our support systems. Does that make sense? So with interpersonal psychotherapy, we go through each and every key relationship and look at what we hope for here, what we would like to be getting, what we perceive we're getting, what we're actually getting, how we could ask for that. We do a lot of role-playing, modeling, conversations, arguments, because what we know about people who are experiencing postpartum depression is that interpersonal support has a huge protective function. Depression the essence of depression is isolation. People don't reach out, they withdraw. So by really focusing on relational issues, we're kind of hammering that point in that no, you actually cannot do this on your own. We identify depression as an illness. It causes your brain, your neurons to fire in this way, which leads to some really dark, low feelings. And the relationships in your life can help support you through this. So it kind of destigmatizes. A lot of the time people with depression will blame themselves for being depressed, or they will blame other people, or they'll feel like this is, don't bother me, why do I bother, I have to stick this out on my own. They feel unlikable and unlovable. So this kind of identifies it, names it. This is depression, and this is what depression makes people feel like. Does that resonate? Okay. We also highlight the relationship between interpersonal adversity, conflict, arguing, difficult interpersonal attachment issues, and depression. And what more brings out interpersonal issues and attachment issues than being a new parent? Being a new parent activates all of our attachment stuff, which I'll talk about a bit later. So if we have some unresolved old attachment issues, they're going to be activated by being a new parent. Our partners might not know that because they've only experienced us as, as my partner. Our friends might not know that because they've only experienced me as this high-functioning friend. So that's why we really want to ally the support of people in these people's lives, and people who are suffering, because it helps reconnect them and get them kind of online again. So again, the focus is on identifying really specifically interpersonal problems that are contributing or sustaining the depression. Maybe it's a perception that I'm not getting enough attention. Maybe it's constant arguments about the same thing. Maybe it's not knowing how to ask for what I need, or giving somebody the silent treatment. So we really get specific with, so when you feel this way, how do you let this person know that? Do you assume that they know it? This is one of those slides I could talk for 3 hours about, so I'll stop myself. It's also short-term in nature. It's meant to be time limited so that we can get really practical. And then do some relapse prevention on a more monthly basis. So because depression has the potential for relapse, it's not, see you later after 12 sessions. There is monitoring and checking in and relapse prevention is kind of built into it, as is all with all good depression treatment. We want to address the fact that sometimes depression can sneak up again, and when that happens, what are you going to do to help yourself through that? How are you going to let the other people in your life know how they can help you? Yeah.
What type of treatment would you recommend for a woman who's a single parent and doesn't have a support system?
You don't need to do this with, having a partner is not a prerequisite. If I were, and I do work with single moms all the time, the way I address that is it's taking an interpersonal inventory, as we call it, an IPT, and that's highlighting who in your life can you rely on right now. What we know is that not everybody is good for everything, right? There's some friends that are great to hang out with and go for a drink with, but you wouldn't want to count on them in a pickle necessarily. So it's really getting really specific. I find rather than speaking generally about, call a friend when you're feeling like this, it's like, okay, which friend are you going to call? And how are you going to reach them? And what are you going to ask them? How are you going to let them know? So it might be another mom friend that you have. It could be a member of your family. It has to be somebody who you feel okay being vulnerable around. That's really the main issue. You have to be okay, and we work on that in therapy all the time because vulnerability is not that easy for people. So this kind of answers your question a little bit more. In interpersonal therapy for postpartum depression, we identify the areas of struggle in the domains of disputes, so arguments, or if not arguments, dissatisfactions, role transitions. So who am I? I'm a new parent all of a sudden. I don't know how to be in this new role. So really getting into the new experience and kind of hammering out what that's actually like on a day-to-day basis, what that means for me if I'm, this adventurous person who gets a sense of self from, doing all sorts of new things all the time. I might not be able to do that. I might have this incredible sense of loss as a new parent. And then grief and loss as well. Sometimes grief and loss is that sense of grieving my lost sense of self, but I think it can also, if there's a history of miscarriage or having lost a child or a baby in the past, having lost a parent in the past, that can really be activated as a new parent. So previous losses, if you've had them, can often really surprisingly come up in that early period after the baby is born. So the emphasis is in interpersonal psychotherapy is placed on the woman's relationship with her baby. Interestingly, when people are depressed following the birth of their baby, they often report that, not always, but often report that their infant is the one person they feel closest to. So even though they're struggling and depressed and have immense guilt and maybe shame and exhaustion and feelings of inadequacy, they still really love their babies and they still really care for their babies. So we really want to support, we want to really emphasize that relationship and emphasize the strengths inherent in that relationship. If there is a partner, then that's often one of the more fraught relationships. Men and women, by the carrier of the baby versus the non-carrier of the baby, if it's a same-sex relationship, have often really different experiences. I've heard it been said so many times that when you're pregnant, you start feeling like a mother as soon as you get pregnant, and especially when you feel the baby move. Whereas for the parent, the other co-parent, whether it's another mom or a dad, it's more abstract to them. It really only becomes real usually when the baby is actually born. So there's different levels of adaptation to that, and so often, sometimes but not always, there's different different transitions in the role transitions happening after the baby is born. I always think about this time when my first daughter was born. She was born in June, and she was 2 weeks old, I think. Yeah, maybe only 2 weeks old, and it was blistering hot, and oh my gosh, was I exhausted, and I was emotional, and my milk was all over the place, and I was just kind of feeling done, and you know, just really wanting some TLC of my own. Sounds reasonable, right? Anyway, I just remember my husband coming home, and I was like, oh, thank God he's home, and he gave the baby a kiss. I'm so happy you're here, and he's like, hey, I was thinking, do you want to go to the jazz festival? I was like, what? In that moment, I felt so alone. Even though I wasn't alone, I felt so alone, and felt so kind of like, oh, this is it. This is what my life is going to be. I'm just going to be the downer, like who doesn't want to do anything. And I hear that a lot, that there's one partner, often the one who's not trying to breastfeed and up all night, who is, you know, kind of like, let's get on with life, like let's get our life back. So a lot of the therapy is around relationship stuff, if there is a relationship. If there's not, let me tell you, there are going to be other people who are interfering or meddling or wanting to help you in your life. There's family of origin, so your own parents, your own family. There's in-laws. I hear a lot about in-laws. And your friends, friendship circles. So there's, no matter who you're getting your support from, it factors into the therapeutic process particularly when there's depression involved. So I know I skipped a few slides. I have trouble being linear. So I'm just going to backtrack a little bit. Postpartum anxiety is kind of like the other postpartum issue that doesn't, for some reason, get as much attention, but gosh, I sure see a lot of it. Has anybody here worked with postpartum anxiety before? Yeah? Pretty common, or? So it makes so much sense to me, postpartum anxiety. I mean, you've got this new defenseless baby, and the world seems like a very threatening place. So it can be, sometimes it can take us a while to identify what's postpartum anxiety and what's just, you know, normal. I'm trying to do the best I can to take care of my baby. So the litmus test for me is how much of the day-to-day functioning is impaired. So the worries are kind of constant with postpartum anxiety. I remember a client telling me that she basically couldn't leave her house because every time she tried to leave her house, her worry was like a moving target. So at first it would be, you know, the baby's going to get hungry, so she'd wait around, the baby would feed. The baby might have an explosive diaper, and then we'll be in a place and I won't be able to change her, and then it was, oh, I think the baby has gas, and oh, it's so cold out, oh look, it's raining now, how am I going to keep my baby safe in the rain? And so it's just this constant moving target, and the world really does truly seem like a threatening place when you have anxiety. It feels that way anyway when you have a baby. The world kind of does feel like a big scary place when you have a new baby. But with anxiety, you're not able, it overshoots reality. So you're not able to sort of say to yourself, okay, I'm freaking out. I need to sort of determine what's a real threat and what's a perceived threat here. With anxiety, perceived threats feel real. And perceived threats, the more we avoid, so the more we stay at home, the more we don't go outside with our baby, the more we avoid maybe, exposing the baby to a new experience. Germs are a big one. Health and safety in general is a pretty big one. The more we avoid that and the more we limit our exposure, the more it reinforces that the world is a threatening place and that the only way to keep my baby safe is, because I'm avoiding anxiety and I'm avoiding that escalation of my kind of panicky, unsettled feeling by keeping our lives in this really narrow sphere. But then I'm also really cutting myself off from other people, and I'm also potentially not exposing the baby to some important experiences, like getting fresh air, for example. What's worse, it can turn into panic attacks and agoraphobia, and it can interfere with the mom's well-being because you're constantly worrying, you're constantly checking the baby, waking up in the middle of the night to make sure the baby's still breathing, getting those baby monitors that send out sirens if it doesn't detect motion. Have you guys heard of those? Yeah. They're intense. So we see a lot of postpartum anxiety kind of overlapping with postpartum depression. They don't have to, I mean, they're not necessarily mutually exclusive, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Treatment-wise, you know, with anxiety, as a therapist doing psychotherapy, I use the same type of anxiety treatment that I would use to a non-pregnant person or to a non-postpartum person because it tends to work. I mean, with generalized anxiety, I would probably use some cognitive behavioral therapy protocols around intolerance of uncertainty because it tends to elicit pretty good results. But I would build into that like a lot of validation. Of course you're worrying. I mean, it's a really normal experience to worry about a new baby. But I would probably say, you know, the feeling makes sense, but let's look at the range of behaviors and how much they're interfering with your day-to-day functioning and see how we can experiment with this. Again, this is a presentation in and of itself, but all of this is to say that anxiety is, when it's mild to moderate, it's pretty treatable with psychotherapy. I think too, I just touched on something that I want to kind of revisit with respect to to depression as well, which is that it's really important to normalize both of those experiences because a lot of people, a lot of new moms with depression and anxiety have some perfectionism as well. Like they really, you know, they really want to appear competent. They really want to look like they know exactly what to do. Part of this is reinforced by our culture of parenting and social media. Not later, but part of it is it can be a personality trait as well. So by normalizing it, it's saying, yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me that you're feeling this way. I get that. It allows them to it makes it safer for them to be vulnerable. And vulnerability is key when it comes to helping people in this particular, to helping people, period, but particularly in this transition. Does anybody have any questions about that so far? Yeah?
I would just be curious to learn how often, when you're working with clients with postpartum anxiety, how often kind of obsessive compulsive thought patterns come up. Mm-hmm. It's something I learned about in another presentation and have since worked it into my practice, asking clients, and it's often like, what would happen if I dropped the baby, what would happen if I dropped the baby, and like kind of related to perceived threats, but also what would happen if I did X, Y, or Z, and that sort of, I think, really scares mothers. And they don't talk about it until they've started to probe, and it's totally kind of in that realm. And
it's so great that you're probing. I think you have to ask the right questions. So, you know, one way I put, just to talk about the probing, for example, is people don't necessarily want to talk about it unless they're asked. So one thing I'll sometimes say is, you know, sometimes when people are feeling overwhelmed or feeling really worried, they start to they find themselves checking all the time or really kind of fixating on this one fear about dropping the baby or exposing the baby to germs, and it starts to become this larger than life fear, and it feels really real. I wonder if that's happening for you? Usually people are so relieved when they get asked a question like that. So with OCD symptom, well, it's interesting. It's in 10%, kind of in line with the other frequencies. The symptoms show up more common than the full-blown disorder. If somebody is presenting with obsessive compulsive disorder, I would be inclined to have them seen have them seen at reproductive mental health for a more psychiatric monitoring. But I see people all the time in my practice with the symptoms, like the constant checking. Sometimes that's their only symptom, is that they're constantly checking. The germ one is huge with new moms, like a real fixation on germs and exposing, really trying to limit exposure to germs. So I do see that, and I do work with that largely in this, like with the cognitive behavioral protocols that one would use for OCD, but always really, really couched in the context of being a new mom, and how, of course, these things, the incidence is 4 times greater in new moms. Like obsessive compulsive symptoms are 400% greater in new moms than they are in the general population. So that helps normalize it a bit. Like it's not unheard of that you'd be experiencing this, and really this is an extension of what happens for a lot of moms naturally. But we want to help you get functional again, and this is how we're going to do it. Does that make sense? Does anybody, did I see another hand? No. One thing I don't typically deal with in psychotherapy is postpartum psychosis, which is far less common, but it's really adamant that it's treated through psychiatry. So usually involves an inpatient hospital stay because of the severity and the risk. So I won't really talk about that, because therapeutically, for our purposes, it's not as useful, I guess, for this type of presentation. So in terms of the risk factors, I've talked a lot about prenatal depression and anxiety, and also just a past history of depression and anxiety. I think any stress around caring for your child, so having a particularly fussy infant is a risk factor. So having a colicky baby is a risk factor. Having a baby that doesn't sleep very much is a risk factor. Having very little support to help you manage some of the day-to-day things, especially in the first few months before they're really on any type of schedule, and it's just kind of full on all the time. Support is huge. So support is a really big factor that we always try and attend to. If there isn't enough support, we look at as many ways as possible to increase it. Okay, so talk about postpartum adjustment now, which is, to me, the largest part of my practice in the work that I do with clients is around just the general adjustment to becoming a new parent, just that total overhaul of my sense of self, my relationship, the way I am in the world, a psychological reorganization, as we call it. And unlike the mental health issues that we just sort of learned about now, 80 to 90% of women experience postpartum adjustment, experience that psychological reorganization, and honestly, I don't know what the other 10 to 20% are doing. So this is something that happens naturally. It's sort of, imagine that you have just started a new job. You've got your dream job. You're so excited for it to start. But you show up on the first day and there's no orientation manual. You learned a few things kind of before you started the job, but now you're just kind of in the fire. and you're trying to figure out how to do everything. You have to think on your feet. People keep putting things up for you on your desk. I mean, what would you do? Well, you'd probably be like, excuse me, somebody. But that's kind of what having a baby is like. You're really thrust into this really intense period without a lot of, well, there's really nothing that can prepare you for that. If you're lucky enough to have an easy baby, then that makes the adjustment a lot easier. But I'm not sure what percentage of people actually have easy babies. None of my clients do, and I certainly didn't, so if you do, I'm really happy for you. So some of the features of depression and anxiety are still really present with postpartum adjustment. So that disorientation, that sort of like, oh my God, what's going on here? I remember saying to somebody after I gave birth and then had to breastfeed this poorly latched, screaming baby, I can't believe that women have been doing this for millions of years and nobody has thought to make this any smoother. I felt like we needed to do some real systemic changes to the whole system, but so be it. And so that reorganization of my family, my sense of self, how I'm spending my time, combined with the sleep deprivation, and combined with the fact that breastfeeding can actually be quite challenging the first time you have a baby, it leads to sort of people spin a little bit, to varying degrees. I know there's some pregnant women in the audience, so I'm not trying to overstate things, but it's probably not surprising to anybody. So the adjustment period can be really short term. It can just be like that wobbling sensation you have before you find your balance, or it can be more prolonged. And if it is more prolonged, it's usually because there were kind of cracks in the foundation to begin with in some respect. Other things needed addressing, and now that I have an infant to care for, the cracks become really apparent. And it's so normal. I mean, think of all the struggles we have just as normal humans in charge of ourselves, right? And think of interpersonal issues, or our stress level, or how we manage conflict, or being in a bad mood, or difficult relationships with family members. It makes sense that when we all of a sudden are operating on very little sleep and have this total shift in our family dynamic, it makes sense that there would be an adjustment period. Also, postpartum adjustment is for all parents. It's not just for the biological moms. It's for, I see tons of dads in my practice, which I think is great. I think it's great that when I see dads or the other co-parents, I think it's great that they're identifying, yeah, this is hard. It's hard for me too. That tells me that this parent is involved, or that they know that things could be better, that they could be more stable, and they know that it's hard to address on their own. And sometimes the partners feel guilty, like, well, do I really have the right to complain here? Like, do I have the right to ask, to ask for help? My partner has it so much more difficult than I do. I had a dad email me a few months ago saying that he had postpartum depression. And you know what? He kind of did. He kind of did. He had, not the hormonal picture, but he had all, as we met and sort of went through his story, he had a real, his loss of identity and how he understood himself, and all like all the anchors in his life were suddenly not very anchoring anymore. And so I think it's really important to think, to conceptualize the postpartum experience as not just a maternal experience, but as a family and couple experience. That being said, there are some risk factors for people that sort of indicate there might be more of an adjustment. So being really young when you have a baby, I still don't know how really young moms do it. Like really young moms. I remember thinking, my gosh, what do 15-year-old moms do? When you're just still sort of, you know, it takes so many built up internal resources to cope with some of the, just to cope with the immediacy and the attachment needs of a baby and the interpersonal stuff going on in with your partner or family. I can't even imagine. But that's, the same can be said in a different way for having your first child later in life, when you've had a chance to sort of feel really competent and feel really in charge and know what you want out of life and feel really kind of used to making things work. It can be a real blow to your sense of self-worth when you feel incompetent, which is the way a lot of new parents feel, kind of incompetent. Doesn't mean you are incompetent, it means that nobody really knows what they're doing at first. Having marital or relationship difficulties that pre-existed the baby being born is a risk factor. Also, the birth itself can be a huge risk factor. I'm seeing a couple right now who had a very traumatic birth, and their baby is fine and the mom is fine, but a couple months later they're really still reeling from it. Like they really, it's instilled them with a really shaky sense of their baby's safety and of their own kind of ability as parents to provide a safe environment for their child, even though nothing that happened was their fault. It really shook them to the core. And I do think, you know, having a birth that didn't go as planned can bring up a lot of stuff for people. Years ago in my practice, I saw a new mom, beautiful little baby. She brought her baby in with her to the session. And so in introducing the problem, she said, well, I had an emergency C-section. I said, wow, how did it go? And the baby looks great. She said it went really well, but I'm here because, and she started to cry. She had so much shame over having had a C-section, and she had planned a home birth. She had fancied herself to be this person where things just kind of, you know, who was able to kind of knock it out of the park, who was able to really kind of do things the right way. And she was mortified. She said that she had been triggered. The reason she called me was that she had been at a mom and baby group and hearing about everybody's home births and water births and epidural-free births. It really triggered her. And one mom made a comment, well, you know, they wanted me to have a C-section too, but I persisted and I tried really hard and I was able to have the baby naturally. So this mom, I mean, the thrust of the therapy was on really looking at, I think I said to her, wow, have you always been this hard on yourself? And that was really what the therapy was about, was how hard she was on herself. But it just, all of this is to say that when birthing doesn't go as planned, it can really, some people just roll with it, but a lot of people, particularly going back to that discrepancy between our expectations and reality, it can be really hard for some people to integrate. Also for people who have had abuse in their history, it could be physical or sexual abuse, but it can also be what I call developmental trauma. So insecure attachments to their own parents can really get activated. People often really experience, if they've had attachment issues, insecure attachment or avoidant attachment, or just had the experience of neglect, a parent who wasn't there for them, they can take on a lot as new parents and kind of really want to right past wrongs in their own parenting. I don't know if other people have witnessed that in clients or in people that you know of. So it's not a matter of changing those patterns easily, but addressing them and really working on solidifying the attachment relationship that's happening right now and it's rooted in the present. Breastfeeding is a huge trigger for postpartum adjustment. Humongous. I wish I could put it in bold, bold in capital letters. So when breastfeeding doesn't go well, moms really do not feel good about that. And breastfeeding, it's difficult, but it's, you know, the backlash to the backlash is such that we're really, really encouraged to breastfeed, which is wonderful because it's good for, it's great for a lot of things. But there is a lot of issues when women find breastfeeding difficult, or if they're not able to do it, or not, you know, if they don't have a big enough supply. It's not just a physical issue. Feeding is it's an issue of nurture, and people really take it on emotionally when it's not going well. I remember years ago, I was with a friend at a popular mom and baby kind of cafe, and we both had little babies, and I was nursing mine, and she wasn't able to nurse for a variety of reasons. It just didn't go well for her, and after very careful consideration, she had decided to bottle feed her baby formula, which helped a lot of things enormously, including the attachment between her and her baby, because she had breastfeeding really had not gone well for her. Her baby was crying and he was hungry, and she was just like, oh, I was hoping to avoid this. And I said, avoid what? She was like, I really didn't want to feed him here. And I said, why? And she's like, people look at me when I bottle feed. Like, they look at me like I'm doing something wrong. And you know, my first instinct was to say, no, you're silly, it's not true. But you know what? There is some judgment when breastfeeding isn't going well, or when people aren't breastfeeding. There is some judgment, and so that can impact the postpartum adjustment phase. And having a fussy or colicky baby, I think it goes without saying, it's difficult. It's really difficult not to, when you can't soothe your own baby. My second child was extremely colicky, and I was beside myself, even knowing what I know and having the psychological sort of lens to look through it. I was just in quite a state. It's really, it's not just scary, it's really, it's a very frayed experience. You just constantly feel on edge, waiting for the other shoe to drop. And I've talked about perfectionism before, and it's one thing that I do work a lot with in my practice, not just with new moms, but in general with perfectionism. But I think it's such a huge deal with parenting, because parenting, there's this, in the past, I would say 10 years, there's been a proliferation on how to parent type of literature and blogs and groups and movements. There's a lot of attention out there in terms of how we parent, and there's a lot of ideology behind that. And I think in some ways that's really great. It allows us to not just default to, you know, status quo. I think it's anything that helps us kind of drill down a little bit into how we do things, how we parent, how we can make parenting, you know, a richer experience. It's not a bad thing. But the net effect of that is that sometimes we feel like there's a right way to do things. And so if you have a bit of that perfectionism in your style of engaging, and you buy into that, there's a right way to do things, when things don't go the way you think they ought to go, we take it really personally. Just another example, I had a client who told me she spent $700 on various baby wearing apparatus, slings and ergos and this and that. I thought that was a lot of money to spend on baby wearing. And I said, wow, why? Like, don't you just need one, or maybe two? And she said, well, my baby doesn't really like being worn. My baby really prefers to be in the stroller. But I know it's better for babies to be worn in a carrier. It helps them feel more attached. And I was like, what does your baby do when you put him in the carrier? He screams. It's just a matter of finding the right one, because I know that's better. And I was like, is it better? I mean, if he's screaming, I don't know. Like, you know, she's like, but that's what I've read. That's what the literature has told me. The literature says, and the prenatal group I said really emphasized that babies are happier when they're in a carrier. And I was like, well, a lot of babies are, but yours doesn't seem to be. So I think there's so much information out there that it hijacks our own intuition about how to match my personal style of parenting with my actual baby. So, you know, we can lose sight a little bit about what this particular baby needs from me. So I don't profess to have to buy into any particular ideology more than another, but I do believe that if it helps, if it feels like a good fit between you and your baby, and the baby appears to work for the baby and it appears to work for you, then it's probably a good fit. If it doesn't feel like a good fit for either one of you, then it's probably not a good fit. And the good news is there's lots of other ways to deal with a crying baby than just one. Yeah?
I'd like to add to your list of risk factors for more difficult postpartum adjustment, which is unsolicited advice from other people.
Is that not on the list? Oh my gosh, thank you.
And unsolicited advice and judgment from others. And sometimes coming from people who don't have kids too. That really, like when you said about the baby carrying, like there's literature on how good it is for bonding. There's also people who think that if you put the baby on you too much, they'll be too attached to you, so you can healthily separate them when it's time to. So anything you do, everything you do, people are going to judge and have something to say about it. And they just say it in your face. They don't ask if you need advice. And that really makes things really difficult when someone feels really vulnerable. They don't know what they're doing.
Exactly. Thank you. Good point. So I'm aware of the time, so I'm just going to motor on here. One of the things that I find really pertinent is our core beliefs about ourselves. So core beliefs are things, they're not really explicit to us. We're not thinking, we're not thinking of these things on a day-to-day basis, but they're kind of old narratives, old fears about ourselves, or old beliefs about ourselves that have probably been with us for a while. And in times of transition, they tend to get activated. So an example of that is I always must get things right. I'm not going to say to myself, I always must get things right, but if I feel like I'm fumbling, if I feel like I'm not getting something right, that I'm struggling, that I don't really feel at the top of my game, I'm going to start, my anxiety is going to raise. I'm going to try and compensate in whatever way I can. I'm going to try and look like I'm getting things right, or I'm going to spend $700 to get the right baby carrier, or I'm going to buy another book to help me get things more right. Other ones are other people are judging me. So these are core beliefs. So the difference between the actual reality that sometimes people are judging me and a core belief is that with a core belief, I default to that. So whenever I feel fragile or whenever anything is in question, I feel judged. So somebody might look at me as I bottle feed my baby, and I might say, that person is judging me. I'm never good enough. So therapeutically, for you therapists in the room, I really go for this kind of stuff when I work with anybody, but particularly with postpartum people, I really try and drill down to these core beliefs, because it really helps people to name, like, it helps it when we can say, for example, I always get things right. It's like, is this just specific to this, or has getting things right kind of come up for you in your life at other points? Like, how far have you been willing to go in life to get things right? And what does it cost you in the process? And what are some other ways of being more compassionate with yourself? So there you go. That's 12 sessions of therapy in 2 little sentences. I need to look good at all costs. That's a huge issue for postpartum women, is looking good. Not just looking good as in like, you know, losing all the baby weight, but looking good, looking like I know what I'm doing, and looking good. I mean, there's been a real glamorification of pregnancy. I couldn't get the permission to use the copyrights, but I found this photo that really illustrated that of like a 37-week pregnant woman, like doing some really crazy advanced yoga pose, and like the comment was like, see, you can do anything when you're pregnant. And I was like, oh, no, actually you can't. This isn't normal. So, but there's this real, like this glamour, like even the maternity clothes, and then even as a young, having a young baby, that pressure to sort of, to look good, to look like, for your baby to look good, for you to look good. So it's, I think, important working with this population, because if there are any core beliefs that are unresolved or that sort of are harsh in nature, they're going to come up, most likely. So I like to examine those, not right away. Right away, I like to just sort of look at what, you know, what's causing the distress in your life right now. Get a sense of that, relieve the immediate symptoms, but then eventually I like to sort of accentuate that this is part of a pattern, because therapists think like that. So these are some of the big ones, the usual suspects with core beliefs. Emotionally too, I mean, this is what leads people to often reach out for counseling, is that emotionally they feel overwhelmed or underwhelmed, and they're not feeling anything. So what are, whoa, just gave one of them away. What are some of the big emotions? You didn't see that. What are some of the major emotions that are happening? First have this baby, you're in the fire. Joy, how do you know that? Anything else?
Fear.
Fear, yes. What am I going to do with this baby? It keeps crying. What else?
Worry.
Worry. Yeah. Anything else? Love. Good one.
Gratitude.
Gratitude. Yes, absolutely.
Exhaustion.
Exhaustion, absolutely. Relief. This thing is out of me. She's healthy. Hopefully, yeah.
Frustration.
Yeah, frustration, absolutely. Yeah.
Overwhelmed.
Overwhelmed. Okay, these are great. You guys are doing a good job for me. So joy, connection, disconnection sometimes. I'm not feeling anything. What's wrong with me that I'm not feeling anything? Fear, like, can I do this? Can I pull this off? Guilt. What if I'm not up for the job? What if I let my baby down? What was I thinking getting into this? Or my baby could do better than me for a parent. These are some of the feelings people have. Or even guilt on a lower level, like, I feel guilty because I desperately want to break from my baby. I feel guilty because I really can't wait to go back to work. So guilt plays into those core beliefs about the right way to parent. Exhaustion. Anger. This is one that people don't talk about very much. I'm angry. Sometimes angry at my partner for not being as sleep deprived as me. Sometimes angry at the baby. Sometimes angry at my own parents. But anger is one that is really uncomfortable for new parents to feel. And anger makes so much sense to me. I mean, what do we feel when we feel helpless? We don't like to feel helpless. As a general species, humans do not like to feel helpless. So what do we feel instead? We feel anger. Think of any situation where somebody is losing it, and I guarantee you, if you scratch the surface, there's helplessness or fear or some type of vulnerable emotion beneath that. I even think of that when I see people have road rage. I think that person's suffering somehow in a way that's not apparently obvious. So imagine okay, and by the way, I just want to mention, when moms get together or in supportive circles, or when people get together and talk about their emotional landscape as a new parent, what do you think it is that comes up the most?
Pride. Pride.
Pride. Well, yes, pride definitely comes up. I am so proud of this person that I created. Nice handiwork. Anything else? People talk about how tired they are all the time. It's all they talk about. And it's true, all parents are so tired, but it's all they talk about. So it's like exhaustion is the one vulnerable emotion that's safe to talk about. I am so tired. How much sleep did you get last night? Oh, I can beat that. I only got 2 hours. Or I'm just so tired. It's so exhausting. Isn't it exhausting? It's so tiring. And none of this is untrue. This is all very true. Babies are exhausting. It's just that there's other emotions that really don't get talked about at all. I've been in a number of baby groups, and some of them are so honest and really revealing. But there's also a lot of, sometimes the conversations between moms, I think, activates people's insecurities. So there is a lot of kind of, I'm not gonna say it first. I'm not gonna speak first about my true emotional experience. So the vulnerability can take a while to get to. I say yes, let's all talk about how tired we are, because that is a very predominant aspect of the postpartum experience. But can we talk about other emotions as well? Like, can we talk about the fact that I'm scared, or that I feel really guilty or conflicted, or lonely, or angry, or guilty, or embarrassed, or whatever. I mean, I think this is, when we talk about getting support, and I think you in the front asked about being a single parent and how do you get support, you have to, in order to really, really feel support and get support, you have to be vulnerable. You have to sort of name your vulnerability, and that's how we connect with others. I mean, that's the only way we can really experience true connection, whether it's with other moms or family members, is by, yeah, we can be proud of our babies and we can be excited and joyful, but if you do happen to have one of these other vulnerable feelings, tell somebody. You might not want to tell everybody, but tell somebody. So imagine that you're this, I just want to talk, I know we've got a little bit of time left. We're good? Okay. So I just want to talk about the postpartum brain a little bit. It's a little detour. It's a bit more of a science lesson, but I think it's really important to understand what's happening in the brain, not just hormonally, but when we're feeling fragile and we get triggered, there's this little walnut-shaped part of the brain. Do you guys see it? The amygdala, that little orange little peanut in the middle of the brain. So that's the part of our brain that is responsible for that fight or flight reaction. It's a really useful part of our brain. It saves our butt in all sorts of unsafe situations. It allows us to get out of danger, or to fight, or to stay put and not let anything worse happen. But it overshoots the mark sometimes. And so this goes back into the perception of threat. So if I perceive threat, and it doesn't need to be actual threat, the threat could be to my sense of self. So if I perceive, like criticism is an example of something that can activate that amygdala. If I perceive that I'm about to be criticized, or that I'm being judged, and maybe I have a history of being harshly judged or criticized, especially if I have a history of being harshly judged or criticized, that's going to activate that limbic system. It's kind of emotional brain. It's very, it's that, I call it that O to 60 part of our brain. And I'm going to illustrate that a little bit, just with my flip chart here. Hopefully without knocking it over. So when our prefrontal, when we're in this zone where we're sort of, our emotions are still there, but we're able to think, we're able to make decisions, we're able to cope and rationalize and think clearly. That means our frontal lobe is online. That's the nice, like a backwards Big Dipper shaped purple thing in the front. So that means our frontal lobe is online, and we can still have emotions. We can still be frustrated or sad or whatever, but still cope with that. But if we get triggered, it's an example of a trigger. Help me out here, people. What's an example of a trigger that we might experience?
A comment?
A comment from someone. So let's say it's a critical comment from somebody, and maybe I'm already feeling a little bit, some self-doubt of my own. Maybe I'm feeling frazzled. Maybe I haven't slept very well. And this comment comes, that can activate that limbic system really fast. And I can become really hyper-aroused. So hyper-aroused means some symptoms of hyper-arousal, when you think about that fight or flight reaction. Your heart is pounding. What else? Anything else?
Shallow breathing.
Shallow breathing, yeah.
Stroke.
Anything else? Flashed. What's happening in my brain? Like, what am I thinking? Right, there's not actually a lot of thoughts going on. It's kind of like, you feel hot. Sorry? Erratic, right. I'm not actually, this is a really bad time for me to make decisions, and it's really hard to cope. It's really hard to problem solve. Depending on my history, and depending on how I've coped with criticism or trauma in the past, or triggers to my sense of self, I can also become really hypo-aroused. And that's also a very physiological mechanism. When the parasympathetic nervous system kicks in and realizes, oh, there's no threatening situation here, it releases all this cortisol, which helps bring me right down, but it works a bit too well. And if it's been adaptive for me in the past to kind of shrink and retreat in the face of triggers, that might be a place I go very, very quickly. So with hypoarousal, can anybody think of any symptoms of that?
Numbness.
Numbness. That's an important one for sure. Anyone else?
Lethargic.
Lethargy, yeah.
Dissociation.
Yes, dissociation. Again, am I able to think, cope, problem solve, make sense of situations? Not really. So in order to do that, we have to be in this zone of optimal arousal. And so how this factors into the postpartum experience is that it doesn't take, sometimes it doesn't take a lot for these triggers to take flight, because we're already tired. We're already feeling like how the issues that come up for us with a new baby are so close to our sense of self, and they're so related to attachment. If a new mother has any sort of attachment issues, even ones lurking in the past, that can really, a trigger like criticism can really do that O to 60 thing again. So it's really important, some of the stabilization, when somebody's in this mode, the only thing that we can do for them is help them stabilize, to bring them down so that they're more somatically grounded in this zone of optimal arousal. And sometimes that's all we can do. There's no talk. It's pointless to talk about core beliefs and you know, to problem solve and all of these things when somebody is really triggered. It's all about grounding them and getting their prefrontal lobes back online, the frontal lobes back online. So imagine you feel this way. You're feeling frazzled and frayed and raw and already feeling triggered. And then this happens. The dramatic effect is quickly being Okay, that's enough. Sorry to all of you lactating mothers out there, if there's any of you. Yeah, it's brutal. When you're already feeling fragile and compromised and you hear your baby screaming and you can't stop your baby from screaming. I don't know why that baby wasn't being picked up, but even if sometimes we pick up our babies and rock them and nurse them and they still scream. So it helps us understand why some people with a particular, whether it's a difficult baby or a fragile sort of emotional state, can kind of reach that tipping point. Does that make sense? No, we're done. We're done here. Help.
Can you hit a stake? Down in the bottom.
Okay. So the point here is a big part of the postpartum adjustment really does rest on some of our beliefs, whether we are aware of them or not, about attachment and how that factors into our parenting experience. There's also some really strong societal beliefs out there about attachment and how to parent and the right way to attach to your child. And some parenting ideologies promote the notion that constant close proximity is necessary for secure attachment. And it is. Constant close proximity is a very, it's an important feature of attachment. It's not just quality of time, it's actually quantity and skin to skin and all of that. However, not all babies like to be worn. Not all babies stop crying when you pick them up, in fact. I know it's hard to believe, but it's true. Not all babies co-sleep very well. In fact, I would say that some, I remember a client calling her co-sleeping experience co-waking. The point isn't to disagree with any of these strategies. They're all great, and I've used them all myself with some degree of success. Some. But the point is to say that when we feel like we can't soothe our baby, we take it really hard. We take it very, very hard, and we start to question our ability to, some of our abilities about soothing and attachment that are really kind of both cultural, societal, but also personal. Does that make sense? Is there any questions about that? As I speak, I'm realizing, gosh, this could be a really long presentation if I kept going. How are we doing for time? Okay. Okay, the last slide I'll talk about then is intimate relationships in the postpartum period. So what usually helps couples feel close is intimacy. sexual intimacy, emotional intimacy, and part of what helps, but I know, right? Like some really creative co-sleeping ideas. I had to write to the illustrator to ask for permission to use this in the presentation. He was flattered. So, yeah, I mean, one of the issues that comes up for couples in this postpartum period is that, you know, their intimacy isn't as easy to attain, whether it's sexual intimacy or just plain old time together, time to talk about things or to go out and do things together. It's one of the things that drives couples sometimes into therapy, I think, is feeling that the things that used to connect them and cement their bond are actually, it's not that they're no longer possible, it's just that they seem like more work when you have a baby. And so a big part of addressing that is looking for creative ways to stay connected to your partner, and also looking at those underlying issues, like what the transition means for you and what the transition means for you, and how do we kind of, you know, lift some of the window dressing that, because when couples feel disconnected, sometimes they argue or sometimes there's a standoff, and it becomes very content-y. It's all about, you know, the content. The baby needs a nap. No, she doesn't. Or that has germs all over it. No, it doesn't. What I tried to do is kind of push that aside and look at the underlying emotional aspects. If things like feeling neglected or wanting more attention, feeling like your partner could have your back more than he or she does, or feeling like your partner isn't as much fun as they used to be. These are the things that really need to be attended to in couples therapy. I mean, otherwise you might as well just, you know, hire a baby advice giver or something, which is definitely not my job. I would refer you, if this is an area that interests you, I've learned a lot from a family systems therapist named Esther Perel. She has some couple of really good TED Talks, and she talks a lot about sexuality and intimacy and new parents. So I think I have to wrap up, and I've got tons more in these slides. So if this is, I guess I didn't realize how fast an hour and a half would go by, but if there's any lingering questions, or you'd like a copy of the slides for your own reference, I'm happy to share them. So just make sure you write down your email address. Amber, is there somewhere for them to write?
The sign-in sheets will just be over here, so if you'd like a copy.
Just make sure you write your email address next to the sign-in sheets, and I'm happy to share the information with you. I'm also happy to receive any emails about the content, or if you have further questions.